From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana. Back in 2019, when Britain last went to the polls, one man called it. He coined a phrase that predicted what became the story of the election.
It's a phrase that I didn't really expect to take on the life that it has done.
He's the pollster who came up with the idea of the red wall.
What it was an analysis to give a sense of whether there were a bunch of seats that might, in a particular election, shift en masse from the Labour Party to the Conservative Party.
And he was right. The red wall crumbled. A wave of seats turned from Labour to Conservative, handing Boris Johnson the biggest majority since Margaret Thatcher's victory in 1987. So what can he tell us about this election and who we are now as a country? The Story today. What do the polls tell us about modern Britain?
Of all of the teams and look at how we conduct our polls. Red wall is slightly misleading. It is neither a wall nor is it totally red. But basically, it's an analysis of English and Welsh constituencies and trying to understand which ones had what we call kind of markers that suggested a big change to come. In the end, though, that term took on a life of its own, where it was, I think, interpreted as northern Labour seats just going Conservative. But underpinning the actual original analysis was some subtleties that I think have been missed since.
James, this will sound like a ridiculous question given your profession, but why do we care so much about polls?
I think we crave certainty. I think it empowers people. I think it allows for a degree of transparency about what's happening. So to really understand and to be able to understand how your views sit relative to everyone else, they've become highly addictive instruments.
Yeah. No, and you're right. I mean, it's really useful having that sense of transparency at a time when things are so turbulent. Do you ever worry, though, that the polling you do might actually influence the poll?
Yeah, that's a very meta question, kind of Heidegger's poll. Does the act of observing something change it?
Right.
It's a very meta question, and it's one really worth raising because the Australians have had real experience of this, which is certain prime ministers being changed during an election because of a bad poll rating. But polls are just a mirror of what's already happening, and I strongly believe they are a very democratic tool. You know, one thing you don't get in countries that are not democracies are polling companies that can do their work unimpeded.
Yeah.
So for me, actually, it's the opposite. It's a real measure of transparency.
James, going into this election, Labour seemed to be, according to all the polls really, leading by at least 20 points. How much might that change, and how many points do they need to be ahead to be able to get a victory?
So this is about voter efficiency. So at the 2019 election, Johnson got 44% of the vote and Jeremy Corbyn got 32%. But based on those results and how they were distributed, Labour would have had to have put on 12.5 points to have a majority of one. But the reality is that the vote distribution is completely different every single election. So at Focaldata, we've gone back to 1979 and tried to work out the exact popular vote lead that each party needed. And it turns out it's completely different every election. This time, we reckon that Labour can probably get a majority with as little as a 5 to 7 point lead.
Wow,
which is totally
so much
different.
lower than people thought.
Yeah, completely transforms. And it's transformed because of who they've won over.
Well, so talk us through that. What do you mean by voter efficiency?
That's basically polling speak for bang for your buck. And voter efficiency is where are you stacking up votes and how does your votes translate into seats? Are you stacking on votes in safe seats or are you winning lots of swing voters and swing constituencies? In which case, whatever your percentage is, it's working a lot harder for you.
So this is basically the first past the post system. So you've got to have a spread across the country.
Exactly. So there are certain demographics that have a real outsized impact on elections
Hmm.
because they are spread very efficiently across the country. The first is older voters. They tend to be much more evenly distributed in the country than younger voters who tend to flock to cities. The second group of people who have a very outsized impact are people who live in more suburban areas. And suburban areas tend to be more swing because the left-right axis does correlate very strongly to a density axis. So on the one hand, inner cities tend to be very Labour and rural areas tend to be very conservative, and the swing seats are very often right in the middle, irrespective of their kind of affluence profile. So again, if you happen to live in a small market town or a seat that is a mixture of countryside and city, or you genuinely live in the suburbs, your vote kind of matters more.
Weirdly, it really helps to win over older people just because they're spread out much more, whereas winning younger voters will just win you the cities and the university towns. And
In general, it's more efficient, but there are other key swing groups as well. People who don't have a university education are also spread more evenly across the country, but so are people who advertisers call C2, which is a technical advertising term for people that work in skilled manual trade occupations. And again, these are the groups that have shifted en masse from big swing voters to pretty safe conservative over the last 15 to 20 years, but it looks like Labour in a matter of years has made massive gains. So suddenly the voter efficiency has increased, which means that Labour probably don't need a 12.5 point lead versus the Conservatives. It probably needs to be something as close to 5, 6, 7 points.
And going into this election, I mean, the really interesting thing about polling is not just the overall numbers, but what's really sort of swaying them. What are the issues that are really changing the way people are voting?
It's about a couple of things. The first is a general sense of anti-incumbency. There's a big global trend here, which is that in general, governments that have been empowered during COVID, which has been an era of very high public spending and resultant inflation and cost of living pressures, in general, most of those governments are getting turfed out. But to think about the UK specific factors, I think the public realm and public services and how they've been run and how efficient they are is a big problem. So I think people feel overtaxed for what the level of public services that they're getting back. I think a lot of people are not clear, I think, of what the right stands for, because if you think about it, they have a lot of political whiplash from the last 14 years. We've had a large number of incarnations of the Conservative Party. We've had a green, liberal Conservative Party. We've had an austerity, an economically right-wing Conservative Party. We've had one that's more Eurosceptic.
We've had Liz Truss.
We've had Liz Truss, which again is kind of more libertarian. We've had Theresa May with slightly more provincial conservatism. We've then had Boris Johnson with his what people call a Brexity Hezza, so pro-Brexit, but substantially further to the left on economics, pro-investment, pro-public services, and then we've had the Sunak years. And if you think about that, there's not much of a thread between all of those prime ministers. And I think that whiplash is real. But again, it's going to be an interesting election.
And in terms of that whiplash and not really being able to identify exactly what both parties stand for, people tend to sort of, or in the past have tended to think of the Tories in terms of stability in a very changeable world. And yet this is a generation when they really want change. Is that what the two parties will represent? Is it sort of the difference between the need for change and a promise of stability and whether you believe in it?
Why people fundamentally vote the way that they do, there's a couple of reasons. Some of it's policy. So in general, there's a cluster of issues that if you care about them more, you're more likely to vote Conservative. They tend to be on crime and defence and terrorism and actually traditionally the economy and concern about high public spending. And then there are a whole host of other issues to do with public services, the NHS, the public realm, potentially education, where if you're more concerned about them, you're much more likely to vote Labour. Now, that was true, except that was really muddied in the Brexit years when Conservatives started to pick up older votes, but particularly those of people who haven't gone to university, and in many cases, people who are working class for the first time, and the opposite was happening on the Labour side. So that really muddied the kind of policy area leads that each party had.
Yeah.
But that mudding of the waters, though, is much less powerful when people just think it's time for change. So you lose all that flavour and nuance, and you just simply get huge numbers of voter groups deciding, right, that's it, it's time for a change of government.
I want to talk to you much more about the realignment, because it feels like that really is the story of this election and probably the next few. And we'll come on to that in a moment. Before we do, though, just in terms of policies that might have an impact on this election, how much is the war in Israel playing out from the polling that you're seeing?
For all intents and purposes, not much at all. It's a very low salience issue.
Because it seemed to come up in the local election, so there was sort of a sense that it might cost Labour some votes.
It will, I'm sure, cost Labour votes, but I'll return back to electoral geography, which is it's not going to cost them many votes in areas that are swing areas. I mean, it's never even in the top 5 or top 10 issues of the country. I think it's more important, though, for what happens after the election, because each party in becoming successful becomes heterodox and very difficult to govern, and that's what the first past the post system does. You win these coalitions of people who believe drastically different things on social issues, on the economy, and you have to hold them together. Labour are clearly going to face a challenge in government from their left flank, and they will also from their right flank. We're back to a world where Labour have won over a substantial number of people without degrees, people who are C2, older voters. They then become vulnerable again, like they were in 2015, to the Reform Party.
Just stepping back, you've talked a bit about the realignment that's been happening across the country. So just set out for us, right now, what would you say a typical Labour voter looked like, and how different is it to Labour, at the last election or 10 years ago? What sort of a journey have they been on?
The way to think about who is a typical voter, not to turn this back to you, Manveen, is to talk about propensities. Which is that everyone has a propensity to vote for anyone. And the key exam question in polling and in politics is who are the highest propensity voters for each party, as well as who are the middle propensity, because those are the swing voters, right?
Yeah.
And who has been the highest propensity Labour voter has changed, but probably not as much as you think it has. It is always skewed young. And what's happened is it's now skewed even younger. It's always skewed towards the degree educated slightly, but now it just skews enormously. It's always skewed towards the public sector. And now that skew is increased over time. All 3 of those trends, it turns out, are going to change again at the next election. That's a function of winning over swing voters. The reality is, in order to win, you need to win over people who are not your base, who are different. And so your coalition looks a bit less Labour-y if you have a large Labour Party, and if you have a large Conservative Party, your coalition looks a bit less Tory. What's happened is that education has replaced the income line, and what most democracies vote on now is an education line.
That's so interesting. And in this country, if you have been to university at the moment, you skew Labour.
Well, at the minute, because Labour are so far ahead, they're kind of doing well amongst both groups. This is what I was saying. 2024 is an interesting kind of de-alignment. So probably from around 1992 up until 2019, you've seen education replace income as the primary axis of division. But here's where it gets a bit complicated. So Thomas Piketty is a very interesting economist, centre-left economist, whose work on inequality is quite famous. But actually, it's his work on political archetypes that was brilliant. And what he said is it's really about the ratio of money that you have for the level of education that you have that demarcates your politics. You asked who's a typical Labour voter and who's a typical Tory. Well, he talked about propensities, and he said the person who's most likely to be left wing is someone who has the least amount of money for the highest level of education. And the person who's most right wing is likely to have the most amount of money for the least amount of education. And the people in the middle are people with either a very high level of education with a high level of income, or people who are the opposite. And he called them the Brahmin left and the merchant right. And he proved out in a meta study that these new archetypes were basically operative across most Western democracies now and had replaced an income divide. So, I mean, if you think about Nigel Farage, an ex-metals trader who did not go to university, but is nonetheless a very rich man,
Yeah.
He doesn't have a college education and is not what we would call a high level of college education or university education, but he is very rich. And so it's not surprising on a demographic basis that he sits furthest to the right. And if you think about a lot of the people who are the shock troopers of Corbynism, they massively occupied this kind of Brahmin left position. And so that's what the realignment means, is this
That's so interesting.
decoupling. Yeah.
So that's really interesting. And you've set out for us who you think the average Labour voter is at the moment. They tend to be younger, university educated, probably living in a city. This is before we get to the election, when there will be an explosion and lots of people who aren't the typical Labour voter will become a Labour voter.
Correct.
Knowing that they're about to take quite a lot of people away from the Tories, what's left of the Tory voter? Who is the average Tory voter now, and how does that compare to who it used to be?
So the average Conservative might be still very similar. There are just fewer of them. I think what they have lost disproportionately is a large set of their Leave voters. So I think the Leave vote is now fracturing three ways between Reform, the Labour Party, and the Conservative Party. Whereas in the 2019 election, it was basically 70% Conservative. I think what you'll see at this election in 2024 is the Conservative vote is likely to tilt higher up on the affluence curve because they've effectively lost a lot of the Leave and working class areas disproportionately.
Right.
So weirdly, it's a bit back to the future, to be honest. The Conservative coalition might look quite similar to how it looked in, say, 2005 or 2001. The kind of geographic, as it were, signature might look quite familiar.
And James, in every election, 1992 included, it sort of becomes political speak, the sort of person who each party needs to win over if they want a path to victory. We had Mondeo man, we had Worcester woman. Who were the key voters this time? Who were the groups we should be looking out for?
Yeah, I'm not a fan of any of those terms. If you can think about an election archetype machine, it's normally one part a swing seat, and then you just choose woman or man and then put it on the end of it.
I'm not sure how that worked for Mondeo man, but
Yeah, Worcester woman or Essex man, or we've had Stevenage. Today we had Whitby woman. Swing voters look very different, not only from the country, but each other. And that is very often missed in electoral analysis. And then who a marginal voter is can be hugely different. And again, it's related to this Piketty thesis that we were talking about, because if the thing that makes you most left wing from a probability perspective is having the lowest amount of money for the highest amount of education, and the opposite is true of the right, well, there's a lot of people who don't fit either of those archetypes at all. A lot of people just sit in the middle, and they can all be different from each other. And the other thing, not to make it more complicated, is that you can have households that are swing households, but really, someone votes Conservative and someone votes Labour.
people have said, particularly since Brexit, that we are a very polarized nation. And that's certainly something you're seeing in America at the moment. Does the fact that we can swing so abruptly from 2019 with a big Tory lead to what looks like now a massive Labour one, does it show that perhaps we're not really as polarised as we think?
This is a really good example of how we're just not America. The American election effectively got just four swing states this time, maybe five if you include Nevada. Pennsylvania with 19 votes, I think it is, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Arizona. That's a tiny portion of the electoral map. This is totally different to the UK, where each election, the number of people who are changing their votes has climbed from around 10% to around 30 to 40% now. That's a really volatile electorate. And a volatile electorate is one that isn't polarized. It's one that's willing to change. It's one that's flexible. It's one that is pretty agnostic about ideology. And I think it's a really good example of maybe we aren't as polarized as we think we are. Politics can't be volatile and polarizing at the same time. That doesn't really make sense. And I think what's happened is some commentators might have borrowed the US situation, potentially a lag from, the 30s and 40s of municipal and provincial conservatism.
Do you think that, it's often been said that Britain is basically a conservative country that sometimes votes Labour. Do you think that's still the case?
I mean, if anything, the theme of politics is everything's been a bit less permanent than we think it is. So the EU referendum, suddenly we have this new divide, and Leave has a huge geographic advantage. That's gone in less than 7 years. We lived through a Conservative large majority, that's now gone. I think the main thing, I call it kind of the sandcastle theory of politics, which is these parties building very thin, wide, but slightly rootless coalitions that can be assembled quite quickly and then come down even quicker. So I'm a bit skeptical as to whether we know whether we're headed to a very different place. The country has, on average, elected Conservative governments much more than Labour. I think it's like 2-1 broadly. That's a function of a couple of things. The first is the first past the post system. There are more progressive parties than there are not progressive, although that now looks set to change. The second is the geography. We think of, I call it the compass fallacy. We think of the north, south, east, and west as if 25% of the public is in each part. It isn't. 44% of the country is basically the south. Britain has a geography, population density that looks like a triangle, right? And that is a huge part of why there has been centre-right supremacy over many, many years. Will that change? I doubt it. The other thing is the ageing population. I think over half the population is now trending towards above 55, and that will only increase. But I think people are more promiscuous politically than they've ever been. So I think it would be very, very hard to forecast, okay, are we now in a more level playing field?
It would be mad to have you on and not ask, what are your predictions for this time round?
Well, I think as things stand, it very much looks like a Conservative loss and a Labour victory. But I think it would be pretty foolhardy to give exact numbers, and I'm gonna bat this away like a politician, but for good reasons, which is that polling numbers can change substantially during campaigns.
I suppose only a few more weeks to go before we know which one we get.
Well, I hope you hang in there.
You do. Good luck with it all. Thanks so much for talking to us.
Thank you very much.
That was James Kanagasooriam, Pollster and Chief Research Officer at Focaldata. Today's producer was Olivia Case, the executive producer is Fiona Leach, and sound design and theme composition were by Maula Seto.